Yeah, so I'm Kyle Mahowald. I'm an assistant professor. An assistant professor at UT Austin in linguistics. And so my PhD was cognitive science, where I did a lot of psycholinguistics and computational psycholinguistics. And what I'm very interested in lately is thinking about how we can use language models to understand something about humans process language, both by understanding them behaviorally and by probing their structure to try to understand something mechanistically about how they're processing language and what that could tell us about humans. And so what I wanted to do today was actually going to try to squish together two quite different projects into this talk because I think they each address in part these questions of that we're thinking about today, which is to what extent do language models offer hypotheses about how human minds produce natural language texts? And then this other question of what might happen in human writers' minds to collaborate with AI when producing texts. And so I think something these have in common is that they both depend on thinking about this relationship between the model output and what it's doing and the training data. And so the plan today is basically to talk through one kind of more computational linguistics project, thinking about syntactic structure and how we can use language models to understand how people might learn and produce grammatical sentences. And then second, this project I did recently with the philosopher at UT, thinking about kind of bigger questions about do language models have beliefs and do they have attitudes and what that might tell us about this collaborative process. So I think to start off, I think it's worth remembering just how far things have come. So here is some generated output from a top performing neural network model on RNN in 2011. So here's some generated text, right? In the show's agreement unanimously resurfaced, the wild pastured with consistent street forests were incorporated by the 15th century BE. Right, so this doesn't really make very much sense. And if you compare that to the kind of output you see from basically any large language model today, you can just tell there's been this really huge seismic shift in the ability of models to produce text which is fluent and grammatical, and even if it doesn't make perfect sense, looks a lot like English text. Right, so a paper releasing one of these models described it as a surprisingly good language model, praised the richness of the vocabulary, said the text is mostly grammatical, noted the parentheses are usually balanced over many characters, and you might kind of know where I'm going with this, right? This was all about this 2011 paper, right? So this seemed like a huge success in 2011, but things have come really far since then, especially I think in the ability to produce text which is grammatical and seems fluent and fluid. Right. So one reaction to this is, well, who cares about the form of language anyway, right? Models hallucinate, they might get math problems wrong or fail in reasoning, all of which is true to some extent, although it's getting less true for some models. Um, but I think that's missing something, right? Which is that this is a really big question for a long time in linguistics and cognitive science, whether we could get fluent formal linguistic competence from statistical co-occurrence and a powerful statistical learner, right? And in part, that goes back to these very old questions in linguistics about debates that, like the poverty of the stimulus debate, which is this old claim from Chomsky and others that there's just not enough in the linguistic input for a data-driven learner to learn complex aspects of syntax. Um, and language models, at the very least, seem to pose a kind of challenge to that, and that they do seem to learn some meaningful syntax. Even though their architectures might have some biases, they're also quite general, and similar architectures and approaches are used in vision, genomics, protein folding, right? All kinds of domains. And so I think there's a really nice opportunity here to try to understand first, how much linguistics is our models really learning? Are they getting the really kind of rare and interesting syntactic patterns right that linguists have long posited as being evidence for really rich structural learning in people? And two, can that tell us something about how people might learn language or how these processes might look in human brains, right? And so there's this kind of whole subfield now asking if you've got a neural model like this transformer network over here, right? It's got just a bunch of weights that are getting propagated through in a word prediction task. And then you can ask whether somehow in this network, all of these linguistic structures that we know and love from linguistics, like syntactic trees and parts of speech and morphology, um, are somehow getting learned and emerging, right, in this black box representation. Right. And often we do think of this as a black box in that it's not easy to just look at the weights and look at the internal structure of the model to know what it's doing. Right. It's not straightforward to ask a question, is it representing a syntax tree? Here I'm going to make the case using a kind of case study that actually there don't have to be quite as black box as they seem. So I've been trying out this metaphor of glass boxes, right? So language models are more than just ChatGPT, and so we can actually train our own models using open data and kind of open source models on very particular inputs and try to get a sense of if that can inform something about how we understand learning. Right. And so the glass box metaphor, right, doesn't mean it's easy, right? It might take some work. There might be some glare. You might drop the box. So you have to be careful with how you interpret these kinds of results. But I'm optimistic about them. So what I want to specifically look at is this one very specific syntactic construction. So this is zooming way in on one very specific English syntax construction, which is the AANN, or the article, adjective, numeral, noun construction. And this is a reasonably rare, although not vanishingly rare, construction in English. And it's basically the "a beautiful 5 days" construction, right? So a kind of default way you might say a sentence like this is the family spent 5 beautiful days in London. The AANN, it's hard to know exactly how many A's to say, right? The AANN puts an A in front of this, reverses the order of the adjective and the numeral, and says "a beautiful 5 days." And so it's kind of curious, right? You've got this A, which almost always takes a singular noun, here taking a plural noun. And the A becomes obligatory here, right? So you can't say the family spent beautiful 5 days in London. You can't say the family spent a beautiful 5 day in London, right? The plural noun is required. The modifier seems to be obligatory, right? So it's not the family spent a 5 days in London. And unlike the normal order of things, in this case, the adjective precedes the numeral, right? So it's the family spent a 5 beautiful days in London. So a year or two ago, I did a project looking at whether GPT-3 is sensitive to this. And to be sensitive to a construction like this requires not just kind of getting the basics right, but also being quite sensitive to the lexical items, right? And so adjectives can be quantitative, right? So like a mere 5 days or a whopping 6 hours means that mere or whopping here refers to the 5 itself, right? It's not the days that are mere, it's the 5 that's mere. They can also be qualitative, right? Like an amazing 5 days or a lovely 6 hours, where it's amazing referring to the days or lovely referring to the hours. But they can't be what are often called stubbornly distributive adjectives, right? So there were blue 5 pencils on the desk, right? Doesn't sound good at all. And the thinking is that blue here, right, refers to an individual pencil, but this construction seems to kind of coerce the noun phrase into a singular unit. And it's not the case that the whole group can be blue, right? It's like the individual pencils in the group are blue. Right? The nouns, often there's measure unit nouns in these phrases, like we spent a mere 5 hours in London, but also qualitative nouns can work. Like I had a mere 5 pencils, a sharp 5 pencils, right? Maybe that's less good. And so there's really subtle lexical variation here, which I think combined with the kind of way it violates some of the standard patterns of language makes it an interesting structure to think about whether language models can learn this, and also because it's quite rare. So I did a study where we got some ratings from, at this point, GPT-3, and compared, I think we've seen plots like this before, basically comparing human and model judgments on these sentences for how acceptable they are. And what you see is quite a lot of fine-grained similarity. So the model judgments are the bars here, and the human judgments are these little triangles. And so for distance nouns, you see quite a bit of similarity, right? Similarly for humans, where you see effects like that, an astonishing 100 students is much better than a stubbornly distributive adjective, like a tall 100 students, right? So stubborn ones are much less preferable. You see here that a whopping 5 pencils and an elegant 5 pencils are better than a color adjective here, like a blue 5 pencils. But you see that with temporal nouns, like a great 5 hours, that's about as good as a mere 5 hours, right? So here you see less of a difference between quantitative and qualitative adjectives. So really at the level of even at lexical variation, you see quite a lot of similarity, right? So the GPT-3 seems to be picking up on something here. I think, right, that's only of such, right, it's interesting to know that. But I think what's really interesting is to get beyond this kind of GPT-3 comparison or other kinds of closed models, and ask if we can really probe how it is that models come to get this knowledge. So here I'm going to talk a little about this more recent paper, Language Models Learn Rare Phenomena from Less Rare Phenomena, which is looking at how do, using open source models that we train ourselves, to look at how these particular kinds of constructions might get learned. And this is work with Kanishka Misra, who is doing a postdoc with me at UT Austin, and did a really great work with this project. Right. So the hypothesis, right, is that AANNs assign higher probability if it's been learned correctly to a beautiful 5 days relative to degenerate variants like A5 beautiful days, A5 days of beautiful days, or beautiful 5 days. So what we're going to do in this learning paradigm is treat this as basically a test and say, okay, we passed the test if the model assigns higher probability to this one and lower probability to each of these. And so that's a pretty strict test, right? It's got to kind of win on 4 comparisons, right? So chance here would be 1 out of 16. But the interesting thing we're going to do is train on, first of all, a smaller corpus. So we're going to train on the BabyLM corpus, which is 100 million words, which was chosen to be roughly comparable to the amount of data a 10-year-old child might have seen. And then we can manipulate the corpus and do things like identify all of the AANN sentences in there, and then just get rid of them, and train another model and see if that one learns AANNs. So the idea is to figure out what in the corpus allows for this phenomenon to be learned. So here's some data. These lines up here are skylines. So these are how well really big models do at this task. And then here's chance way down here. And then this is our kind of default model trained on the regular BabyLM corpus. And it's somewhere around like 75% accuracy, which is pretty high, right? Humans would be maybe a bit above these skylines, but not much, because there's some, yeah. So the first thing we did was then, okay, let's identify all of the AANNs. So that's why this robot here is a bit paler, because these AANNs have been kind of filtered out, and see how well this model, which has been trained on now a corpus which has no AANNs in it, how well does it learn AANNs? Interestingly, and a little surprisingly to us, it was still quite far above chance, right? So around like 45% accuracy. We then said, okay, instead of training on AANNs and getting rid of them, let's try training on some weird degenerate variants like ANANs, so A5 beautiful days, or NAANs, right, which is 5A beautiful days, which is very strange. And so that's why, right, these models look a little dyspeptic. They've ingested these bad degenerate versions. And then see if we learn the AANN. And again, in all cases, right, even though they're not seeing any AANNs, and in fact, they're seeing these degenerate variants, they still kind of like this AANN construction. As controls, we then asked, okay, what if instead of trying to get it to learn this, we instead test using the same method, but now test for how well does it learn A5 beautiful days, right? So this wrong version. If you train, no surprise, if you train on the default corpus, right, this version doesn't get learned at all. If you train without any ANNs, it also doesn't get learned. If you put ANNs into the input corpus, it's going to memorize it a bit, so you get above chance performance. And if you train on NANs, you don't get anything. But the kind of key point here, right, is that this learning is way less good than what you learn on actual ANNs, right? So it seems like there's something special about the AAN itself that lets it be learned well, which isn't just explained by memorization, right? And the same is true for NAANs here, right? These look kind of similar to ANNs with the exception that when you train, there's a little memorization. So what this suggests, right, is that there's something else about the input that's letting the AANN get learned kind of better than these other variants, even if we get rid of it entirely from the corpus, right? And so we had a few hypotheses for what that could be. And I'm going to kind of go over this a bit fast so we can get to the a second part of the talk, right? So the hypotheses were that maybe it's related constructions like the version, the usual $40 fine, or phrases like a few plums, which behave a little similarly, even though you don't have adjectives in there. Or like lots of cases like this, like 6 months is a long time, where you've got a measure phrase treated as the singular. And so we found that when we remove these kinds of things, you actually get really big hits in performance. So it seems like what's happening, right, is that it's not just the case that the model is memorizing these rare constructions, but it's using some kind of shared structure from related constructions in order to learn this more rare construction. Right. So I think there's hope here, I would argue, that language models, right, could offer us hypotheses, coming back to this big question about how human minds produce natural language text, specifically by taking seriously the idea that the kinds of structural learning and the kinds of generalizations we see in models might actually be nicely applicable or transferable to human minds, right? So for something like the key to the cabinets is on the table, right? A classic sentence where you need to know that there's subject-verb agreement, which is typically thought of as hierarchical. We think to get that sentence right, you have to have some notion of grammatical subjecthood and agreement. And like one hypothesis, right, is that these grammatical theories can be useful in real patterns, even if they're not in the brain in some explicit way. And that might also be true for models, right? It might turn out that models can get sentences like this right, even if they don't explicitly represent these structures. But I also think, right, there's good reason to think we actually might find those structures represented there. Because, right, there was a recent argument from Ha et al., from Philip E. Solo's group, that if a complex problem is being solved, right, we might expect converging solutions, right? So this is from this paper. They have this nice visualization that if you're solving some task and the same system has to solve some other task, solving some task and the same system has to solve another task, you're going to end up with a relatively narrow piece of space that's being solved that represents a solution, right? And so you might expect if humans and models are solving the same problem, they're going to converge on some kind of solution, which is informative one for the other. Okay, so those are some arguments, right, that language models can generalize enough to produce fluid, intelligible text. That doesn't, right, as I've argued elsewhere, right, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have fluent underlying thought. And I think, right, there's lots of examples that you can find of models, even, advanced models like GPT-4, failing at certain kinds of common sense reasoning or higher level reasoning or theory of mind and so on, even if they can produce this fluent grammar. And so I think that raises interesting questions as we kind of broach this issue of what does that mean for how we collaborate with them and how we interact with them. And so in that vein, I wanted to talk a bit about this topic, right, which is when we collaborate with the language model, who are we collaborating with? Are we collaborating with all the other humans whose data has gone into the model? Are we in some sense collaborating with another entity with original ideas? Is it more like going to a library? Yeah, do they have beliefs? And does that matter for the purposes of collaboration? And so we addressed some of these questions in this paper, which is a bit more of a philosophy paper with one of my philosophy colleagues at UT, Harvey Letterman, which is called Are Language Models More Like Libraries or Like Librarians? And I should say I'm not a philosopher, and so I'm here without a philosophy chaperone, and so I'll do my best here, but I wanted to share some of these ideas from this paper. Right. So the idea we introduce here, which we call bibliotechnism, right, coming from kind of the idea that goes back to Alison Gopnik, right, that language models don't actually innovate, is this point Alison Gopnik's been making, right? They're more like cultural technologies like books or libraries, right? Then they don't have thoughts or beliefs or intentions of their own. Ted Chiang, the science fiction writer, put this really well, I think, that it's like searching, like using a language model is like searching over a library's contents for passages that are close to the prompt and sampling from what follows, right? And in some sense, this has to be true, right? These are word prediction machines. But there's a kind of puzzle here, right? Which is that they do generate novel text. And so Tom McCoy et al. In this Raven paper showed that if you look at n-grams, right? So 1 word phrases, 2 word phrases, 3 word phrases, all the way up to 10 word phrases. Once you get to like 5 or 6 word phrases, most of what a model, I think this was GPT-2 at the time, most of what GPT-2 generates is unique and doesn't occur in the training data. And so there's a bit of a puzzle there to think, well, if they have no thoughts, beliefs, or intentions of their own, and it's just like looking in a library, what do you make of the fact that a lot of the text you're seeing is novel, right? And so we have this accountant here drawing on the tradition of externalism in philosophy of language, right? That, you know, if the biographer, right, Shakespeare was born in 1564, we kind of, and, you know, we assume the biographer was a human. We typically take that to mean that that's referring, you know, Shakespeare here is referring to this guy. If this is the guy, there's some controversy whether that portrait is actually him or not. Right. So if a photocopier or a printing press reproduces a page from that book, we have no problem assuming that it still refers, right? Shakespeare in that sentence, no matter how many times you reproduce it, still refers. So with n-gram models, right, so these are kind of models which predate language models, but in many ways are kind of the spiritual forerunners, right? In that you're predicting a word based on the n-1 words that occurred before it. So if you're this is from Drafsky and Martin, if you got a sentence like I want English food, you can model the probability of that under a bigram model. It's the probability of I given a start character times the probability of seeing want after I times the probability of English given wants, right? So this is a kind of precursor to what modern language models are doing. So if you have a model like this, which is trained only on single words, so it's basically just producing words randomly from its training data, you're going to see random nonsense, right? Like red is Shakespeare without a block. And I think we're pretty comfortable saying that doesn't really mean anything. That doesn't seem to have beliefs or intentions, right? None of these questions that come up with language models would come up with the model like this. Even if it got lucky and there was a 3-word sequence Shakespeare wrote plays, we don't think it has the right kind of causal mechanism for producing something which is itself meaningful. But if you have like a 1,000-gram model, right? So a model which is memorizing like 1,000 words at a time and just reproducing them, that's not that different from a photocopier, right? And so it seems like the original intentions and the whatever kind of special properties the original author had are going to get carried through in a 1,000-gram model. So we kind of ask this question, right? Are modern language models more like the photocopier or more like the unigram model? And we make the point, right, that it seems like in a way you can think of what a language model is doing as inheriting the intelligible text of its input and reproducing that intelligibility in its output, right? And so by and large, if a model is producing intelligible text, it seems like maybe it's doing so derivatively, right? So it's getting that intelligibility not on its own, but by figuring out the kind of right way to take original text and rearrange it in such a way that it's still intelligible, but somehow inheriting the meaning from the original, right? And so you can see the paper for a more workshop version of that. But there's another puzzle there, right? Which is that you can also get something like ChatGPT to refer to something that it just made up. So you could say, make up, you know, draw some diagram and refer to some part of that diagram. And here, right, it gets really hard to try to give an account for how is it, if the diagram, it doesn't exactly appear in the training data, um, by virtue of what would we say that it's inheriting this ability to refer and this novel reference, this reference ability from the training data if it's referring to something which doesn't actually appear in the training data, right? And so you might even then consider the idea, well, does this mean, language models have beliefs or intentions or something? And there's actually one framing, which I think is most associated with Dennett as to what beliefs are, in which this kind of claim is not really as dramatic as it seems. And we'll say a bit about that, right? And this goes back to this idea of Dennett's, the intentional stance, right? And so Dennett has this nice analogy to say, imagine an alien, right, predicting human behavior based on atomic physics. And let's say the alien is really good at this somehow, right? They have a really sophisticated understanding of physics, and they can successfully predict that I'll wake up and I'll go get a cappuccino tomorrow morning, right? If they're doing that without any kind of appeal to the idea that humans have beliefs and goals and intentions, it feels like something is missing from this explanation, right? And so Dennett's account is that that's basically what beliefs and desires and intentions are exactly these kinds of higher level explanations that help us make predictions about each other, right? And so I can be confident that, somebody I'm talking to has beliefs because their behavior turns out to be very well modeled by the idea that they have beliefs and they behave reasonably rationally. And if I think that this is a person who really likes coffee, and I know they typically drink it every morning, I might be well founded to predict that they have a desire to get coffee and predict they'll get coffee the next day, right? So I think this gets into interesting questions about if we start collaborating and start using language models to produce text, as we've been talking about for the last day, right? And so here is a story where told ChatGPT I wanted to write a story about Dan, who's a French professor at Harvard who works on proofs in AI. It wrote just like an awful story. It's like a kind of cheesy story. So their literary abilities, like kind of as we saw with the poetry examples yesterday, aren't quite there maybe as high literature. So Dan with his tousled brown hair and a perpetual glint of curiosity in his eyes, blah, blah, blah. Right, and it kind of tells this story about this French professor who works on proofs and AI. Right, and so if we're doing this kind of collaborative task, one story, and which is a true story, is to remind ourselves this is all next word prediction, right? Each word it generates is because of some stochastic process that it's learned for what statistical distributions of text look like. And right, that really is the real story in some sense. But on the other hand, if we want to interact with the model and use the model, there's something that's kind of not so tractable about relying entirely on like our actual knowledge of how the model works. What's more tractable might be attributing something like belief, desire, intention to the model and saying, well, it seems like based on what it said so far, that ChatGPT thinks Dan is a French professor and has brown hair, right? And there's other kinds of beliefs implicit here, right? That like Proust takes he pronouns, that a French professor has students, right? Like giving lectures and talking to students are the kinds of things French professors do. It's right here, it says a nod to Proustian tradition when he sipped his tea, right? It has some belief that tea is Proustian. And so if we attribute these kinds of beliefs to the model, right, that might help us actually predict what it's going to do and how we might interact with it. And if we're trying to use it in some way for collaborative writing, that might help us. Right, and that's true, even though in some sense, right, it could mislead us if the model is hallucinating too much, or on these like famous cases of like, unfaithful reasoning or failures in reasoning or hallucinations, where pretending or assuming too much that of the model's kind of rationality or belief status could mislead us, right? So it puts us in this kind of, I think, funny in-between position, right? And so on the one hand, we have this really well-developed toolkit for cognition and collaboration, which involves thinking about other minds and thinking about beliefs and other reasoners. And so on the one hand, it seems like a bit of a shame not to be able to put that to use here. Right. And so I think Dennett himself put this well. He actually, in his memoir from last year, kind of raised this point about, is the intentional stance appropriate for language models? And said the intentional stance will give you a good but risky tactic for interpreting the counterfeit people they, meaning language models, create. But right, that raises this point that, like, are we able to interact with something uh, and make good predictions about what it's going to do if we try to completely bracket the kinds of strategies that we've developed for collaborating and thinking with humans? And to kind of close, I think this Dennett quote, which he actually wrote about vervet monkeys, actually feels, in 1983, feels kind of prescient about kind of what it's like to deal with language models, which is, it will turn out on further exploration that vervet monkeys and chimps and dolphins and all other higher non-human animals exhibit mixed and confusing symptoms of higher order intentionality. They will pass some higher order tests and fail others. They will in some regards reveal themselves to be alert to third order sophistications, while disappointing us with their failure to grasp some apparently even simpler second order points. No crisp, rigorous set of intentional hypotheses of any order will be clearly confirmed. The reason I'm willing to make this prediction is not that I think I have special insight into vervet monkeys or other species, but just that I have noted, as anyone can, that much the same is true of us human beings. Right? So this is about monkeys, but I think this kind of mixture of occasionally impressive behavior mixed with surprising failures, I think is very familiar to those of us who have spent time working with and thinking about language models. So I think this kind of last bit here, right, I thought had interesting resonances with what Martin was talking about, right? So I screenshotted this bit from his slide, that humans provide the original intention and hence I would argue retain intellectual property. But I think these get into really tricky questions about, one, if you're a human collaborating with the language model, and the model is producing text, to what extent is it your intentions? To what extent do the intentions of the authors, which are somewhere in the training data, but have been all chopped up and rearranged, to what extent are those coming through? So yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things to discuss here. But with that, I will thank the collaborators on some of this work I talked about, and yeah, open it up for questions.